Go ahead, Tim. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Andy. I think, Andy, it's okay to mention that was Andy Olshan, and his nonprofit is Cascade Clusters, which is a fantastic organization that trains and employs often formerly homeless people, houseless people, to build. A number of other people have been chatting with me about how much they're into kind of work development. But I wanted to particularly comment on what you said about you need to start with something cheap enough to reach a lot of people quickly. And I really strongly agree with that. And funnily enough, that's actually kind of a rare and almost very controversial view, because essentially we have a housing system that over 100 years or so has radically transformed into something that almost totally prevents like self-build and incremental building. And so weirdly, methods of building which are completely normal for all of humankind's history and for much of the world now are illegal and almost unimaginable to people now. Now, that's not quite true. We do add garages and things like that. But, and anyway, so I'm really keen on the angle. And I think it also dovetails with the angle of like helping everybody, because almost everything that you see out there that is on the topic of affordable housing is like, we're going to create this many units, or we're going to do this. And it almost never is anything discussed of like, this is what we're going to do for everybody. There are very abstract calls for housing as a human right, but I'm very keen on like, what's the practical way that we make that true this year, that we assure something to everybody. And it comes from long observation and also personal experience that for the people in the most dire circumstances, you can help greatly with very simple measures. And knowing that it's just morally indefensible to me and impractical and failing on every pragmatic level to just do nothing for thousands of people when you could so easily. Now, I know there are concerns that you might attract people. Maybe all these people will, stop striving and working, whatever, there are predictable objections. But, I would say in the worst case that happens and we learn it and we change course, right? But in the meantime, we're letting people just die on the street. Now, to get concrete about it, and building on what Andy said, the kind of scenario that really intrigues me is when we have regulatory changes or reforms or that potentially unlock the ability to do things at a pretty large scale. And that's why I'm really keen on like statewide reform, and why I'm glad to hear that Andrew mentioned that you're meeting with a state senator, because a single project can take all of your organization's attention for years. And it's really hard to like resource pulling back and thinking about what's the multi-year plan that gets the right provisions into the state code that allows thousands of sites. And as I've kind of waded into this field over the last few years, what I've gradually realized is there's a gigantic machinery by which that happens. And it's this whole landscape of organizations and meetings between legislators, and you don't know that. You have to sort of wade in and gradually learn the levers of this. And also, it reminds me of a saying that comes from technology. There's a saying, innovation is overestimated in the short term and underestimated in the long term. And the application of that here is to say, when you start, you look at trying to do things and you think this is just unbelievably complicated and hard, even to just execute a project under the current rules, let alone try to change a set of rules that a giant industry is built around. And you're just like, oh my God, how can that be done? On the other hand, if you look over a multi-year period, particularly in like Oregon and California, it's actually quite remarkable how much has changed. So like there are all these things going on that 5 years ago, I would have said, you're crazy to think that'll ever happen, in California and here. So that's very encouraging, but you have to kind of like understand the metabolism of this process. But we are starting to see these things that really are having major potential. And so getting to concretes here. So the kind of scenario that really intrigues me is we have this legislation, HB 2001, that was passed like 2 years ago, that really challenges the kind of single family large lot system and opens the door to putting substantially more units. It's still being worked out, like how widely, but it's kind of like a giant shot across the bow to the old system that says that, you know, like more housing and infill is coming. Like it's when, not if, kind of thing. And so it's opening up possibilities where, for example, fourplexes, even up to sixplexes, as Andrew mentioned, and cottage clusters may be allowed potentially on almost any single family lot, depending on how a locality interprets it. And then another very interesting bill that I'm behind was just introduced by Senator Lieu from Portland and Senator Klatt from Bend that would allow lots to also be divided into however many parcels they would allow homes. So if they would allow 4 or 6, you could divide it. So here's the thing that kind of intrigues me, reconnecting to Andy's point, is you say, okay, well, let's say it suddenly becomes a lot easier to like divide lots into 4 or 6 parcels that can be separately owned and built, or it becomes significantly easier to put like a cluster of cottages. Well, it also is become possible in Portland to have a vehicle residence on a property, or it appears likely to become that. So the kind of thing I think about is, okay, so we have these shelters that get set up, these outdoor shelters, and we deploy to them on large scale, potentially in thousands and thousands of units, like a simple trailer structure, a simple kind of low-cost basic shell that would be a huge step up from being on the street, and it would be probably deployed in villages with facilities. But the empowerment of that is that there's a pathway to incrementally step from that into permanent sited housing, because you could literally roll it from the village to a house that would agree to host you. And then you could potentially upbuild this small trailer and cabin and put it on a foundation. And there's now actually a clearly visible legal path that you could do that. And to me, that's really exciting and new, because what you have out there in the conventional discussion is you have people talking about shelter and all these kind of like remedial, ameliorative things. And then there's this vision that this is transitional until we find permanent housing. And that's just kind of like this giant what if out there. And that stream of permanent housing that's envisioned as the endpoint is like happening nowhere near the scale or pace needed. So I'm like, let's not keep dreaming on these castles in air. And in particular, let's think of it from the standpoint of the person in need who needs something definite, not the possibility of something in years, right? It's easy if you're comfortably housed to talk about our rate of production and what's coming online years from now. But let's think about how we can do something immediate that actually has built into it pathways that lead to the outcome we actually want of permanent, stable, secure housing. And also, I would say, let's bring into this conversation from the start how that evolves towards ownership and co-op housing, and not continue the kind of underestimation that's gone on for decades that says, poor people can only be renters and subsidy receivers. They can't be self-sufficient. They can't own. Let's aim higher. Let's aim to give everybody what we think everyone should have. So anyway, back to you, Sean.